Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. That was a Byzantine chant. O Virgin, pure, immaculate Lady Theotokos. Speaking of rejoicing to the unwedded bride, rejoice. It calls everybody into delight in the Virgin, which is a big part of the discussion that we're going to be having today. We're going to be talking about Isaiah's Virgin, one of the most notorious Old Testament passages that is disputed, especially amongst scholars, secular and Christian alike. So these are things that we're going to look into today by unpacking Isaiah 7, Matthew chapter 1. Are they the same? And is it possible that Mary is actually the one that Isaiah foresaw hundreds of years before the announcement of the great angel who came to her and told her that she was going to be benefiting from the grace of God that was given to her, and that through that, she would bring the Messiah into the earth? And she said, let it be done unto me. And so is it possible, is it even entirely possible that Isaiah was thinking or writing of such an idea far, far in advance? It seems far-fetched, but as we get into it, we need to keep an open mind and think about the fullness of what's going on in these prophecies. Now, remember, a lot of times we get to these prophecies and we have two schools of thought. One crowd comes in and immediately jumps all over this and says, that's definitely Mary. This is Matthew 1. That's what it was always referring to. And then they actually limit their interpretation too. And then the other hand, the anti-Christian movement, those that are in Judaism and so forth, will look at this passage and say, what in the world are Christians doing with our passages of Isaiah? They're just butchering it. They're creating all kinds of ridiculous ideas that were never a part of what was always meant to be in this. And they have Christianized a Jewish text and made it apply to their Messiah. So there's two groups that jump into this immediately, and they already are on the defense. Let's all put down the weapons and let's just look at the full context immediately in the way that Isaiah presents it, and then look at the fullness of that as it unfolds. All right. So we're going to jump right into this. We're not going to waste any time. One of the things that I wanted to do today is get into the notes and talk about the problem in the passage here. The problem in the text doesn't satisfy everyone because there's ultimate fulfillments and immediate fulfillments that have to be considered. So as we talk about the problem here specifically, and I'm going to back up into the signs, what's going on in this passage to begin with? So Ahaz, not a great king. We learn more about him in 2 Kings, specifically about what he did that was dishonoring to God. He did not follow in the footsteps of David, and so much so that he was buried in a distinct location away from his forefathers who did follow in the steps of David. So he wasn't a good guy to begin with. And so Isaiah comes in and tells us beforehand that the enemy is not going to prevail against Israel. But he goes further into this discussion as to what took place in light of God's prophecy. So in verse 3, God tells Isaiah and his son Shear-Jashub to meet Ahaz near the upper pool. He's like, all right, you're going to go to the king. You're going to have a conversation. I have a message for him, and you need to tell him exactly what I'm going to say. Let's go into his response. So Shear-Jashub, meaning his name, meaning a remnant shall return, was in of himself the message to Ahab. Because this is not necessarily a return from captivity, but to God himself, which you see later in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 22. Now, God's message is that the alliance that was building between the north will not prosper. So Ahaz has already made up his mind. He's building this alliance all the way into the northern region with people that God said not to do any business with. He has comfort in this for some reason. He finds great delight. And so God is actually not happy with him. God refers to Rezin and Pekah as two stubs of smoking firebrands in verse number 4, meaning they were all smoke, no fire. Literally is the idea of that. These are two people that you're trusting in, and they seem to be good because they show a lot of potential and they show a lot of ideas, but they're going to falter. They're going to go out like a firebrand. Now, there was a conspiracy going on at the same time because everybody's kind of using everybody in this situation, which seems to happen in bad alliances. I need you, you need me. We really don't like each other, but we need each other for a moment. Well, you may get what you need out of them for a moment, then everybody starts stabbing each other in the back. Well, that's the exact thing that we're going to be dealing with in the text. And you may ask, well, what does that got to do with the Blessed Virgin Mary? What does that have to do with anything with this idea of looking at Mary in Isaiah 7? Well, remember, I stated very clearly, we're going to take our time. We're going to look into the text itself. We're going to get the immediate context, and then we're going to go to the actual view from the New Testament perspective and get the fullest meaning here. So in this, we don't know much that's going on about what's happened with Ahaz. They elected a king already to replace him because his own people were mad at him. His own people are against him. And so it could be that somebody was trying to do some sort of conspiratorial work on one end while another conspiracy is happening on another. It's an absolute mess. So the summary of verse 8 is this when we're in chapter 7 of Isaiah. The alliances that are built on the purpose of doing evils to others will absolutely fall apart, because you reap what you sow at the end of the day. And in verse 9, it shows that faith has tremendous power. And then what ends up happening? There's no faith, and it all crumbles. Ahab's life crumbles, and his reign as king. So that kind of brings us up to the sign, the big picture here. So that's kind of the background. Alliance is being made with Ahaz in the north and parts of Assyria. God's telling him it's not going to make it. He sends Isaiah with a message, tells him, this is my son, this is his name. You will return, specifically to the Lord. Your alliance is not going to make it. You're going to falter. People are already conspiring against you. Don't create another conspiracy. So Ahaz now has to interact with the message of God. So here's what comes into play. Now, we don't actually know the length of time between verses 9 and 10, but God puts Ahaz to the test. He offers to give Ahaz a sign to confirm the promise prior to these verses. And God allows him to pick the sign. He tells him that he could pick this sign as deep as the grave or as high as the heavens. You'll see that in verses 10 and 11. Now, in verse 12, Ahaz shows a level of pious. He declines to take the sign that God says you pick. As deep as the grave, as high as the heavens, you pick one, and I will prove my promise. Now, he seems to reject this in the text with a sneer by quoting the law. He quotes Exodus 17, you will not tempt the Lord your God. Now, at this point, keep in mind, he'd already made up his mind to trust in the Assyrian alliance, against which he knew Isaiah would be like protesting and saying, you can't do that. That's not what God wants. Now, he's hearing this message. The alliance is already made. He's already confirmed it. He's already comforted by it. God's trying to give him a greater comfort, which starts with a spiritual revival before it goes into a captivity warfare issue. God saying, I will give you any sign you want. Now, this is very rare. We don't see this often in scripture. We see people ask for signs and not get them. We see people trying to do things like maybe Gideon with the fleece. God entertains those things at times. But this isn't Gideon going to God kind of situation. This is God going to a king, not a good one. And God is telling him, pick your sign. It doesn't matter if it's in the afterlife, in the depths of Hades itself, in the grave, Sheol in Hebrew. You pick that sign there. Or if you want it in the heavens, ask for a sign in the heavens. I'll show you the sign in the heavens. And Ahaz is like, well, oh, no. I would never tempt the Lord. That's against the law. It sounds great and all, but his sincerity is lacking. Now, in verse 13, the house of David is addressed, perhaps because Isaiah had already experienced arguments from the royal family themselves, or it could be that God was going to address the entirety of David's bloodline and give them a sign to show his covenant with David will not fail. By the way, I land on the latter. I think this is exactly what's happening here. They're looking at this sign, and in verse 13, you have these words. Then he said, listen now, house of David. So it could be that he's addressing the immediate home, Ahaz's family, and giving them a reason to listen to the message of God in this sign. Or it could be that he's speaking to David's bloodline then and forevermore moving forward. Or it could be a combination of both. So let's kind of look at the signs here. I want to pull this chart up that I have on the screen for those that are watching on YouTube, those listening on the podcast. I'm going to read these references. If you'd like to look at it later, you can go back and watch the video portion of this. But let's look at these signs and how God gives them as it relates to the birth, children, specifically sons from the very, very beginning up to this point. Genesis 4:25. It says, Adam knew his wife. She gave birth to a son, called his name Seth, because God had appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. Now, I got this chart specifically from Mackey, and he notes in 7:15, it is a compositional note that stands outside of the birth announcement in 7:14 through 16. So when this text is compared to nearly every other birth narrative, like the one I'm about to get, the one I just gave and more, when you're looking at the others in this perspective, compared to all of these naming scenes, Seth and so forth in the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 7:14 through 16 stands outside of a pattern. It no longer follows patterns before it. So in 4:25, you have, call his name Seth because God had appointed another offspring. Later in Genesis 16:11, behold, you are pregnant, you will bear a son, you'll call his name Ishmael. Now this is a Hagar, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. Exodus 2:10, the child grew, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. See the pattern here? There is a individual who gives birth to a son. They give it a name, and there's a reason behind it. So let's continue. 1 Samuel 1:20. Hannah was, here it is, pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. That's A. B, she called him Samuel. C, because I have asked him of the Lord. Next chapter in Isaiah, after the one we're dealing with, chapter 8, verses 3 through 4. So I approached the prophetess, and she became here it is, A, pregnant, and gave birth to a son. And Yahweh said to me, here it is, B, call him Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. C, because before the boy knows how to cry out, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. Notice how it changes in our text. We see in Genesis and Exodus and 1 Samuel and even in Isaiah this continual pattern of birth announcements. But then we come to this one, and it's unique. You have a virgin will become pregnant and bear a son. That's consistent. There's a calling of a name here. You shall call his name Immanuel. And then it gives this, he will eat curds and honey at a time. He knows to refuse evil and choose good. And then there is a because before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good. The land whose two kings dread will be forsaken. But notice there's an additional clause which takes up that entire verse 15 that interrupts the pattern that we see in these other passages about the curds and the honey. So we're going to get into some of that. But let's look back at the verse that's the highlight of this evening, verse 14. If you didn't already know this, it's extremely debated as to whom the virgin is and to whom she gives birth. So in this birthing narrative, this child, this Immanuel, this God with us child, who is he? Who is she? There's not a specific name that has been addressed for her. There's for the child. And there's even a reason later, but there's some interruption and pattern of the announcement. So the house of David, remember, in verse number 13, the house of David is being addressed. The Lord offers a sign to the king of that household currently. Even though Ahaz says, I will not tempt the Lord, trying to be pious, God says, I'm going to give you a sign anyway. The sign that God gives is that a virgin would conceive. Now, the debate is the Hebrew word for virgin here is almâh. Now, the basic definition of the word almâh means a young woman of marriageable age. So this is a young maiden, if you would. And there's a lot of people that will run to this, especially liberals, who are against the scripture that is say, this has been asserted and manipulated and twisted and redacted. At the end of the day, this is nothing more than just a young maiden, because that's all almâh means. Now, that is true. Almâh commonly is translated young maiden of marital age. But it can be implied and used to mean virgin as well, like in Genesis 24:43 and also in Exodus 2:8. Now, that is where we are at a struggle and an impasse. Which direction do we go with this? Do we continue to explore it and just say, well, it's a young maiden? Well, we have ancient translators who are reading this passage and had to do a little bit of interpretation to come up with a Greek word for the Septuagint in order to translate almâh. Now, the Septuagint translators believed it to mean a virgin here, not a young maiden. See, the problem that I continually deal with on this subject is, Christians have manipulated this. Christians are the ones that are implying this. Only Christians created this kind of idea. Well, that's actually not true. Jewish thought clearly believed the context here gave us a reason to believe that this was more than just a mere young maiden, but rather a virgin, because the translators here of the Septuagint, they go in and they use the word parthenos. By the way, the word was used in the Byzantine chant I played at the intro of this. By the way, thank you for joining this episode. If you're listening for the first time on the podcast, we're glad to have you. Make sure you follow us, hit your notifications so that new episodes come to you. We deal with passages like this. We deal with the apostolic fathers. We deal with anything related to the apocryphal texts. We deal with canon, scripture itself, and text of scripture, and textual criticism. So if you enjoy anything like that, this is the kind of channel you're going to want to follow. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. If you're watching this on YouTube, we're not doing it our typical night, but I've got a lot of things going on, so I wanted to make sure I got an episode in for our followers. So thank you for tuning in, even on an off night, if you would. We're really glad you joined us. Make sure you hit that like, subscribe button if this is your first time. Also, make sure to share it on your favorite platforms if it's helpful and you're learning from it. There's also a link in the description. If you've been following us for a while, you want to be a help as we continue to build things towards a merchandise store, as well as building up our website that we're looking to do next year. Please, one-time gift or monthly gift, it'll go a long way. We are 501c3. We're ran by a board of directors. So if you would do that, many of you have done that in the last month, and I really, really appreciate that. It's going to go toward a lot of the projects we want to do. All right, back to the text as we took a pause there. The Septuagint translators come to this passage of scripture and they say, I think almâh here must be referring not just to a young maiden, but to a Parthenos, a virgin. So the Septuagint translators, they're not influenced by Christians. They preceded Christianity, Jesus, Mary, and all this. They had no agenda to push here by going with the Greek word Parthenos when they came to this passage. Now, also, it should be noted that the Syriac used a word which also means virgin, but they went further and said pure virgin. The Vulgate went with virgo to imply a virgin as well. So Latin translations of this passage, Syriac translation of this passage, the Septuagint translations of this passage, all come to the belief that the passage can be defined by its context, the word almâh, by its context, and that the context must be referring to a virgin. So why do all these ancient translations of this passage believe it to be that? Why don't they think it means just a young maiden? I believe the text itself presents a few reasons, and I think this is what these ancient translators were getting into when they were studying this. First, let's talk about the sign itself. God offers Ahaz a sign that could be as high as the heavens and as deep as Sheol, the grave. So here's my translation of all that. Something out of this world and supernatural. God is saying, ask of me something that is out of this world and supernatural. Folks, a young maiden becoming pregnant is nothing out of this world and supernatural. It's common. There were a lot of young maidens, including in Ahaz, his own household, who were of maritable age that would get pregnant and have children. In fact, that was pretty much the standard in society. So what kind of sign would this be? What would he gain? Now, some could argue in the context that it relates to either Isaiah's wife or Ahaz's wife here, and that it would have immediate implications. But is that really what the sign would limit? Would that really be as high as the heavens, as deep as Hades, or as deep as Sheol, depending if you're reading this in the Septuagint or the Hebrew? Really? I don't think it grasps the full idea here, and nor did these ancient translations who came to this passage believe that that was sufficient enough to make that argument. A young maiden becoming pregnant was not unusual. But there's also a second reason. I think the sign is connected to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and the proto-evangelium, when the first message of the good news was given after the fall of man, when God speaks to the woman. Now, if you are in Isaiah, he loves the Edenic language. He is constantly borrowing from Edenic imagery, fall, redemption. All of these things continue to go, even in the restoration of Eden, the fall of Eden being brought back to a relational place for God and man again. This imagery is all through the book of Isaiah. So I believe he's going backward into the Edenic imagery, going back to the woman whose seed would combat the seed of the serpent. Because remember, it was kind of an anomaly to hear God speak to Eve in a manner that says, I will put enmity between the seed of the woman, when women do not have the seed. Men carry the seed. So just on the idea of a woman bearing seed is kind of confusing, but now it's almost as if Isaiah is developing the theology that was always intended behind it, that the seed of the woman would be just an amazing and miraculous birth. that something supernatural, a sign that can't be explained in the normal natural elements, has now been brought to understanding. I think he's developing and understanding the idea of Genesis 3. But there's still a problem within the text. And this is where the critics come in and say, whoa, Stephen, there's still an issue here. Now, as Christians, we believe the ultimate fulfillment of this is in Jesus and Mary, that we find later in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1. But does a 700-year-old fulfillment satisfy the sign that is being currently offered to Ahaz and his household? I don't think so. This is where I say we need to leave both extremes out of this discussion. I believe this prophecy is an amphibole. Now, what is that? Well, it's a literary device where an author writes about two things at the same time. And it doesn't take a genius to go through the Old Testament prophets and find this being used regularly, especially in the Hebrew language. It had an immediate impact with a future fulfillment, meaning when Isaiah is giving this prophecy through the sign that God says, I will give you, it had immediate implications to Ahaz and his family, but it would have farther reaching fulfillment in its future. And so I believe that's what's happening in this passage. So there's an already not yet reality that's going to transpire through this whole thing. But again, I think there's still a problem. It appears no one can come to an agreement on who the person was that conceived in Ahaz's day to show his family a sign. See, again, as Christians, we go, oh, well, this is Jesus and Mary. I mean, this is pretty simple. But remember, God had a message for Ahaz. So even though, yes, I believe it has the future end of it in Jesus and Mary, but there has to be an immediate understanding that would have made Ahaz respond to God's sign. I think there's three potential views as to what the immediate context is of this virgin. Let's look at the name Immanuel, God with us. Could be the remnant that returns from being attacked, meaning God's people generally. The reason I say this is in chapter 8, verse 8, the very next chapter, the people are called Immanuel. It says, then it'll sweep on into Judah and overflow and pass through. It'll reach as far as the neck, and the spread of its wings will fill the expanse of your land, Immanuel, being the people of God. God does refer to Israel as his son on a few occasions in the Old Testament. He does this in Exodus 4:22. He does this in Psalm 82, verse 6. And he does so also in Hosea 11:1. Which also, by the way, Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I will call my son, is also another amphibole that I see being used that Matthew picks up on in the same exact section. So I don't find that ironic. I find that intentional. The virgin at that time would apply to all women who had not yet conceived in that region, but would bring offspring into the land that would later become the remnant that is being referred to. So that's possibility number one. The hint could also be the phrase, and this is what we highlighted earlier in the chart, curds and honey. It identifies the Immanuel child as the one among the remnant of the land, verse 22 of chapter 7, who will survive the onslaught of the Assyrians in chapter 17, or verses 17 through 20 of chapter 7. Because the land will be forsaken and revert to wild production, i.e., curds and honey, will be their diet. Herbs and wild food, not farmed wheat, bread, or vegetables. So that's possibly number one, the immediate context Ahaz, is that the virgin is all women who have not yet had children who are going to be the remnant that come into this and return. And that the people, the offspring, these sons, are the Immanuel of the immediate context. That's possibility number one. Possibility number two is that Immanuel could be Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, which is the child's name, which means speed to the spoil. Now, this is a very popular view. In fact, many Christian scholars would land on this one. The reasoning for that is in chapter 8. The first thing shown in the next section here is Isaiah's wife having a son, and two witnesses are validating the whole process. Now, another reason for this is because in verse 8 and verse 10, it uses the term Immanuel in the same passage. In addition to these, Isaiah states that the children the Lord gave him were for signs and wonders in Israel. Now, the main issue that I have specifically with this argument is the fact that Isaiah already had a son in chapter 7. The only way the sign would work with his wife is if he had a second wife in chapter 8 that would fit the description to be either the visual or the literal sign. And I don't think that could work because he already had a son who he brought to Ahaz as a message in chapter number 7. So even though this one is the more popular, I would choose option 1 over option 2. Now, if you're listening to this in the comments, I want you to tell me what you think the immediate sign is. I want you to tell me who you believe the immediate sign could possibly be. Do you think that it is A, Immanuel, the people of God, these virgins are all women who have not yet conceived yet? Or do you think that it is possibly Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, the son of Isaiah in chapter 8? Or do you think it is the third one, Immanuel being Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz? Now, Ahaz began to reign when he was 20 years old, and he died at the age of 36. Ahaz was short-lived. He didn't have a long life. He was my age. He didn't have much to go off of that was positive either. Now, it's very possible that Ahaz was in his early 20s when this is taking place, and he was betrothed to a young virgin who was about to be his wife, which we find later her name is Abijah. You find that in 2 Kings 18:2. Now, in Isaiah 37:30-32, this helps fill the argument out even more. Ulrich Burgess states, the sign of slowly increasing fruitfulness of chapter 37, verse 30, is reminiscent of the promise of a new beginning through a holy seed of the felled stump, chapter 6, verse 13. The term escaped one recalls chapter 4, verse 2-3 and 10:20, each of which speaks of a remnant as if found there in chapter 37. The state that a remnant would go forth from Jerusalem and a group of survivors from Zion evokes the thought of chapter 2, verse 3, which says the Torah will go forth from Zion and Yahweh's words from Jerusalem. So the quote in 37:32 borrows from chapter 9, verse 6, quite literally, which reads, the zeal of Yahweh of hosts will accomplish this. This indicates rather that the reader will connect this passage with the entire royal oracle from chapter 9, verses 1-6. This sign from the Immanuel prophecy and this sign given to Hezekiah point to the same direction. The remnant community locates itself in the place of Immanuel, to which 9:5-6 and 7:14 are aimed. And he says that in his section of commentary on Isaiah. So the argument can be summarized as this. Hezekiah would be the Davidic bloodline figure that shows a temporal deliverer rescuing a remnant from their bondage and opposition. Though he himself would not be the ultimate deliverer, we find that later in 38-39, he makes a horrible mistake. And then he would play a major role in giving evidence to the fact that God keeps his promise to his covenant that he made with David prior, even though it's being threatened in chapter 7 where we just were, but he wouldn't fail. He would not fail Hezekiah, and he would not fail David, and he wouldn't fail any of the promises that he made. Similar how to look at Ahaz and say, look, your life is short. Now, he didn't tell him these words, but your life is short and it's going to end short, but your son is going to be a sign of my promise to David that I'm going to continue it despite you, not with you. So Hezekiah may have been the sign, similar to how in Haggai 2:23, Zerubbabel, the prince, became a signet, a sign for the people of God to his promise to David. Now, Ahaz forfeited this opportunity to be used by God in a special way. It doesn't mean God's not going to keep his end of the promise just because the king doesn't cooperate with God. That is what I believe God meant by being established in verse number 9 here, chapter 7. So he died young, and what's most known about him can be referenced in 2 Chronicles 28:1. He did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord as his father David had done. That was his life in a description. Also, it states in verse 27 of 2 Chronicles 28, they buried him in the city in Jerusalem. They did not bring him to the tombs of the kings of Israel. His defiance against God cost him an honorable, really, burial. So let's look at the fulfillment. So what is the immediate response here that we're seeing? I think it is either option 1 or option 3. I think either one is fine. Honestly, I'm not dogmatic on either. There are times where I see the way that Matthew later uses Hosea 11:1, that I think he's referencing option 1 here because that seems to be his protocol. But I also think option 3 with Hezekiah is a very, very valid possibility. I don't buy the Isaiah son in chapter 8. I think it is the least likely, but I do want to hear from you. If you're listening to this in the live stream, just put your thoughts. Do you think it's 1, 2, or 3, or A, B, and C? Which one do you think is the most likely for the immediate context of Isaiah? And then if you're listening to this after the live stream, I still want to hear from you. Put it in the comments. Also, by the way, I don't know if you know this, so those that are listening on the podcast, you're allowed to comment as well. I see your comments and can respond to them. Feel free to do that as well. It'll also boost the video. So that's the immediate context. That is the immediate line that we're dealing with. Now let's look at the fulfillment of this. Remember, I talked about how it has an already, not yet idea. So there's the already. Let's look at the not yet, because ultimately, even if it says Hezekiah is the sign, like I said, he blew it. He completely blew it at the end of his life. God extended it and showed him grace, but he didn't become the figure everybody wanted him to be. There could not be a fullness to what God had prophesied to all of Israel in this section by anybody in Isaiah's household or Ahaz's household or the people of God as a whole. It's not possible. They could not bring the full fulfillment of this. The only woman who could fulfill Genesis 3:15 and conceive a child in a out of this world kind of way, something that is as deep as the grave and as high as the heavens, was Mary, the Blessed Virgin. She gave birth to a child having never known a man, Matthew 1:18 says. Now, Matthew reflects on Isaiah 7:14 passage when considering the angel's message to Joseph, not Mary. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. But if you're in the Gospel of Matthew and you're in chapter 1, he starts putting the pieces together in his gospel after the proclamation to Joseph, not Mary. Now, Luke predominantly focuses on the Marian side of this, but Matthew seems to bring this in after speaking with Joseph. Matthew would have known the story of Ahaz and how he did not believe the report of Isaiah, and how Ahaz had been given a sign for assurance, but had no effect on him at all. It had no bearing on his decision-making moving forward. The Messiah in this passage of Matthew was going to be called Yeshua, Jesus. Now, the Messiah being called Jesus brought Matthew to the understanding that salvation was finalized in this child that Mary was going to bear. It wasn't a figure like Hezekiah or Isaiah's son who saved his people from their enemies or helped his father give the message to save his people from enemies. It wasn't just going to be another messenger, another prophet, or another king, but it was going to be his people, Jesus, who would save his people from their greatest enemy. Remember what he says? You shall call him Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. I find it ironic that Joseph awoke from his sleep in Matthew 1:24. It says, Joseph awoke from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and he took Mary as his wife. Now, he did what Ahaz wouldn't do. What's that? He wouldn't believe God. He wouldn't believe the sign. Think about this. He's getting news that Mary is pregnant. He's betrothed. He's betrothed to this young woman. And he's being told that it was not because she slept with somebody else. Hard to believe that. Somebody reading or listening to this message would go, sure, okay, yeah, you didn't cheat on me. Got it. But the angel comes and says, no, this is of the Lord. Now he is thinking of Ahaz. He has to be. The prophecy that a virgin would conceive. And no, Christians didn't start that way of thinking. I just demonstrated other ancient translations like the Septuagint already had these kinds of ideas. They already shared these kinds of thoughts. So no, I don't accept the connotation that, oh no, Christians influenced the text. When the Septuagint, Syriac, some of these others that are older and already doing translation of this had no problem looking at it as a virgin. So if Joseph was from the region that he was in, it seems like Greek had reached that place. He may have been trained on the Greek translations, or he had been familiar with interpretations similar to that. It's very clear that Matthew, when writing this section about Joseph receiving this, immediately goes to Isaiah 7. And he shows us a man who is also in the line of David, who chose to believe the sign. He chose to believe God, whereas King Ahaz did not. So in relation to that, what I find interesting is that in the Gospel of Matthew, it is highlighting Joseph's response almost in place of Ahaz, where Ahaz did not believe, but Joseph did, because that's a difficult sign. And again, what would be the complication of a sign if it just means a young maiden of marital age? If she were to conceive, that's a sign. There would be thousands of signs walking down the streets of Jerusalem because young maiden were getting pregnant all the time. There's no major sign there. However, if a virgin, if almâh could actually be understood in the way the translators of Septuagint put it, in Parthenos, well, now that's something to keep an eye out on, even though there's an immediate implication that comes from it. And it could be that it was option 1, option 2, or option 3 that I shared. I lean more with option 1, but I'm open to option 3, and I'm not sold on option 2, as I stated. Well, folks, I appreciate you joining this episode of Facts. This was a last-minute decision to change it. I'm going to be extremely busy over the next couple of days. I'm going to be on a couple of other podcasts and videos dealing with the subject of Daniel specifically, its dating, its composition, and also its manuscripts. That's going to be coming up. I'll be with Jonathan Sheffield on another channel dealing with 2 people who are part of Judaism, who reject the idea of the Son of Man being applied to Jesus of Nazareth, or they'd honestly be rejecting this video right here. So I wanted to make sure to get our weekly podcast in because you guys are faithful followers and listeners. So I just wanted to make sure we jumped in and dealt with that this evening. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully it brought some sort of nuance idea that you had not thought of before, even though most of our audience comes on Sunday night and they're going to be like, wait, this thing's a day old when they're looking at this video. If you're listening on the podcast, it'll come out normal time for you. It'll be released exactly when you're used to seeing it come out. We started releasing them on Sunday mornings. And then we're going to be jumping into a couple episodes coming up. All right, this is what we got coming up. There's going to be a 3-way discussion between myself, Tyler West, and Pat May, two co-hosts of mine. We're going to be going through a couple of discussions as it relates to Revelation 12. We already touched on the woman. Pat and I did. Now we're going to be discussing the archangel Michael, the dragon being cast down to earth, and the inhabitants of the earth being told, woe to the inhabitants of earth. So we're going to be looking at that in spiritual warfare. We're going to talk about demonic possession. We're going to be talking about exorcisms. We're going to be talking about the spiritual battles and that we face today. So we'll be looking at that. All three of us will be a part of that discussion. That'll be the next one. Parousia, the coming of Christ, the communion of Christ, all these things that we've been doing. Pat and I are going to finish out the short series that we had started, and we're going to tie in the St. Michael one with it. Then we're going to end it out, finishing the imagery of Revelation and the heavenly liturgy on earth. So we're going to look at that by looking at the parousia. That'll be coming up in the week after that. So keep your eyes and ears open. Also keep your eyes and ears open to the future ones I'm going to be doing on other channels. I'll try to share them on my social media. I started sharing stuff on Twitter more lately because people keep asking me to. So I started sharing stuff on my Facebook as well as also on Twitter. So keep an eye and an ear open for that. And as always, folks, grace and peace to you. God bless.